Now that we're 5 years into the Overwatch League's existence, I think it's about that time to do a retrospective of just how successful every single team has been since the very start. But instead of doing it in the typical 1 through 20 fashion, I figured it'd be more enjoyable and less complicated to do it in a tier list. But what exactly goes into ranking a franchise either high or low on the spectrum? Well, for me, in the sake of this video, it's going to be on a couple of things. The first of which, and of course the most important when talking about this thing, is accolades and accomplishment. Have they won the grand finals before? Have they even won a tournament previously? Do they have playoff success if they haven't won anything before? How close have they gotten to actually being significant? Are they a team that you have talked about often throughout their lifetime? Have they consistently been a threat? Do they have a lot of amazing players and a rich history? And then beyond that, you gotta think about relevance and consistency. Have they been good multiple years, or are they more of just a 1 to 2 season wonder? And in between those amazing seasons, have they had disastrous seasons, or just okay? All of that stuff is pretty important when deciding where to rank a team on the spectrum, plus a lot more, and I'll be sure to give you all of my reasoning for every single team, and make sure to play along down in the comments below if you're interested. So first up is the Atlanta Reign, and right off the bat we're starting off somewhat strong. They're not amazing, but compared to a lot of teams, they've actually done a decent bit. And I say that for one reason. The Atlanta Reign have never had a really bad season before. They've had some mediocre or just okay ones, sure, but they've never had one of those awful seasons where you completely forget about them or you wonder what the heck they're doing over there. All things considered, that gives them a leg up over a good bit of their competition, as some of those other teams out there have had one season like that or multiple seasons where they are completely terrible and they're at the bottom of the standings. And generally, they do pretty decently in the playoffs, as 2022, I believe, is the only season where they didn't actually win a single playoff matchup, so not too bad on that front. They've also been in multiple tournaments throughout the years. They made a grand finals appearance in 2021 and had one of the greatest upsets of the century when they beat the San Francisco Shock in the 2019 playoffs. But when you look beyond that, they just don't have much going on. Yeah, they've had their moments of relevance, but they've never actually won anything before. No tournaments, no grand finals. I mean, outside of that grand finals matchup in 2021, they never actually made it to any other finals in general. I like the Atlanta Reign because they always seem to show up when it matters. Just look at what they did at the first half of 2022, as well as 19 and 21, like I was saying before. All of that is good and well. They're clutch. They're good when they need to be. They're decently managed. They've boasted some decent talent throughout the years, but they don't have any true accomplishments to their names. They've been pretty consistently relevant, but that's all they really have going for themselves. But I'm going to give them a B tier for the simple reason that unlike some of the other teams on this list that have maybe won something but haven't really been good in other seasons, the Reign are at least okay each year. And I think that's a lot better than just having that afterthought of memories of that one good moment you had followed by a lot of bad. So let's give the Reign a nice baseline B tier. Now it's Boston Uprising time, and now we're going from pretty relevant to not very relevant. Boston's greatest feat sadly comes in their first season of existence. They just haven't really met that mark ever again. Season 1 was basically as good as it got for them. They had a solid record back then, 3rd place in the Overwatch League overall, I believe, record-wise. They made it to a Stage 3 final. They have that 10-0 stage, the only team to ever do so. All of that is good and great, but what do they have going for themselves outside of that? They had a fluke, I guess you could say, Stage 1 2019 playoff appearance where they lost in the first round to the Titans. They got absolutely obliterated. And then I guess there's that other time in the 2020 playoffs where they beat Houston in the first round of the play-ins, but Houston were awful that year anyway. Boston beat them 2 times. It's really not saying much. So, yeah. They basically had their best season since 2018 last year, and they were the lowest seed in the NA play-ins. Boston's history is sadly full of mismanagement, horrible signings, budget rosters that have absolutely no chance to succeed, terrible decision-making by the front office, player drama everywhere you look, org drama everywhere you look, and a bunch of losing seasons or mediocre at best seasons. 2018 is the only season where they won more games than they lost. I'm hoping that 2023 can change their fortunes, but for now, as it currently stands, Boston Uprising get a D tier. Chengdu Hunters. Yeah, they're in a similar boat to Boston in a way where they had that one season of glory. However, what Chengdu has that Boston does not, is their meteoric rise to fame in 2019. They're more of a beloved franchise for being the Chads of the league, if you will, by playing Wrecking Ball with Among and playing DPS comps when everybody else was playing GOATs. And then in 2021, that's the big thing. That's their one season where they truly had fame. You still had Among and those cool guys, but Leave was playing at, well, an MVP level because he won the MVP award. Chengdu were really fun to watch. They even won a playoff game. They went to multiple tournament finals. Chengdu were fire that year. But you gotta look at the big picture. Yeah, they have the longevity with their fans. They've always been a pretty popular team since their inception, and 2021 was excellent, but that's all they really have going for themselves. They haven't won anything significant, and in most seasons, they have been mediocre or below average. It's not like Philly, where yeah, they haven't won anything, but at least in most years, they've been somewhat good or have had a fighting chance. Chengdu, you never really got that feeling except for that one lone season. Other than that, there's been just mediocre rosters or budget problems, so I'm going to say that Chengdu are a high D tier. You could maybe argue low C if you wanted to, but with only one season of real success, how can I really put them higher than Boston? Time for the Dallas Fuel, baby, and oh boy, they're a tough one to gauge. They're coming off of grand finals, and in 2021, they finished third place in the playoffs, but when you look at their entire existence as a whole, their first 3 seasons were full of drama, pain, suffering, and a ton of losing. Through their first 3 years, you could argue that they were the least successful or one of the least successful teams all time. And that's what ultimately keeps them out of that tippity top tier. Too many horrible seasons at the start. However, what they do have is a pretty epic turnaround over the last couple of years that have seen them boast more success than most franchises could ever dream of. In 2021, best team in North America, arguably. Made top 3 in the playoffs. They won the May Melee tournament. They were doing some really excellent things, and then they carried on that momentum. They won another tournament in 2022, and of course, they won the grand finals, which is the big thing. And I gotta say, the last 2 seasons I've seen an epic turnaround for these guys. I mean, truly. They've turned around that winning percentage big time. They look like a completely different team. They're managed much better right now. And the fans are more into it. The fans have always liked the Dallas Fuel, which definitely gives them some points, but the last few years I've really seen them rise to meteoric success. We won't forget what happened early on, but they've won a lot of games, a lot of important games over the last couple of years, and they've become world famous for good reasons rather than bad, and it's going to leave a really good taste in our mouths. A lot of that bad history has actually gotten erased in a way, so I feel pretty confident giving the Dallas Fuel an A tier. And from A, way back down we go, because we're moving on to the Florida Mayhem. Outside of a clean walkout game, some big-time fan favorites, and some of the best skins in all of Overwatch, the Mayhem don't have much going for them. They had a couple of decent or good years, arguably, like in 2020, they're pretty awesome. Some saw them as a dark horse contender, and in 2022, while no one expected them to win a championship, they're still really fun to watch. They made a lot of tournaments, they made the playoffs. In the few years where Florida were relevant, they did a lot of great things. But the thing is, they've never had a truly dominant season for one, and outside of their 2 decent seasons, where, mind you, they didn't win any tournaments or come in first place at any moment, you have a couple of really terrible seasons. 2021 wasn't that great, but it's 2019 and 2018 that really do them in, as these are 2 of the worst seasons we have ever seen back-to-back years. You know things are bad when the things you're most known for are Tavik being your bus driver, which is just terrible, having awful management, Saya player, and your walkout game. That's it. Those were the only reasons they had any sort of relevance in their first few years. And then you have the flop that was 2021. I get it, sometimes things don't work out, but that just adds on to your bad legacy overall. What the Mayhem have going for themselves is 3 total playoff wins, 2 against an unprepared Atlanta Reign team, and 1 against just an okay Gladiators team at the time, and a second place finish in the May Melee. They only have a couple of big time wins in their entire history, and they just really haven't done anything, and I'm waiting for them to take that next step. Florida Mayhem get a D tier. The Guangzhou Charge. Oh man, I desperately want to put these guys in D, because they just haven't done all that much, but they do have a tournament title from the 2020 Summer Showdown, which immediately gives them a leg up over, 8 other franchises who have never won such a thing before. So right off the bat, they have to be more successful than the teams that we have in D tier so far. But how much further can you really put the Guangzhou Charge when looking at their history? 2019, they're just okay. 2020, They made the playoffs. They're one of the best teams in the league back then. I think like, a top 6 record or something like that. Really, really good stuff. But then the last few years have been pretty bad. 2022 saw a cool comeback and all, but they still weren't anything great. They had a strong first half of their existence, and they had the title on top of that. They had 2 seasons back-to-back of more wins than losses, which is excellent. But it's these last few years and not really finding any playoff success whatsoever that makes me think that they can't be any higher than a C tier. They have their one moment of fame, and that's genuinely it. Then we have their counterparts in the Spark, who are kind of in the opposite boat, where outside of 21, they've been pretty decent overall. They've always managed to make the playoffs, really, outside of that one season. They've had a couple of really solid playoff pushes as well, like 2019, where they had a really solid rise to the scene. They finished top 4 that year, and then they finished top 4 again in the 2022 playoffs. Those runs are valuable. They made 2 really solid lower bracket runs and got some quality playoff victories that a lot of other teams in this tier list are simply lacking. But unlike the Charge, they lack that true, definitive gold medal that you are looking for when you're trying to rank a franchise high in a tier list. I appreciate the Spark for their runs and for making the playoffs more than they haven't, but between not having any sort of gold medal or trophy and having multiple dud seasons, they can't be any higher than C. The Houston Outlaws. Oh, Houston, Houston, Houston. Any of you who have been watching my channel for a long time know that I am a big-time critic of this team, and that's going to translate into this video as well. I find Houston to be fun to root for, but man is it hard to trust them based off of what we've seen over the years. Like, come on, man. Last year was their best season they have ever had, by far. What they did last year was pretty darn impressive. Top 4 in NA in terms of the regular season standings, making a top 3 finish in the playoffs is also really, really awesome for them and was unexpected. They show that they're finally turning the page and they're making progress. And honestly, the last few years in general, I've seen them make a turnaround, just like the Dallas Fuel, where they were pretty the first couple of years, but then these last few have been pretty fun. They've tried to build these awesome teams through Dante, but most of them have sadly failed, and even the teams that were pretty good like these last few years oftentimes felt disappointing, where they choke away consistently these big-time opportunities to make a splash, make a tournament, go on a playoff push, and they've oftentimes failed more than not. There were so many chokes, especially in 21. I mean, it's ridiculous. And up until the 2022 playoffs, there were a ton of missed opportunities in those tournaments too. And we can't possibly forget about the abysmal struggles that we had to suffer through from 2019 to 2020, where they were constantly losing and looking like a laughingstock of this league. What carries them, though, is they've been pretty consistent overall. They have a dedicated fan base, and they've had 3 seasons, if you include 2018, where they had more wins than losses on their record. But it's those shortcomings, man. That's what keeps me from ranking them anywhere near high or even mid-tier. That's like the ultimate overarching theme with Houston. They've had a lot of opportunities compared to other franchises, and they've seemed to fail at just about every corner with the exception of 2022, where they won on an epic playoff run. And mind you, this is the only time they have ever won any sort of playoff game. I can't base their entire existence off of one season. Sorry to say it, Houston fans, but Outlaws are going in D tier. The LA Gladiators. This one's hard because I feel like they've done well, but at the same time, they still could have done more. I'm in this weird crossroads with them. I say they could have done more because it's felt like they've built multiple championship level teams in the past, but there was always something that stopped them from being truly great. They always spend all of this money every single season and made the big time moves to try and be the best, always get their fans excited, just to fail when it really mattered. Along with not having a grand finals, that's why they can't be put in like S tier or anything like that. But it's mostly just me nitpicking, as the LA Gladiators have been a solid franchise. I mean, they have been a rock ever since the very beginning. They have never had a losing season before. You heard me right. They have never had a losing season. Whether it's worked out in their favor or not, winning has always been very important to them, and they have shown that consistently throughout the years by managing to make some pretty solid looking teams, and they've made the playoffs every single season without fail, which is excellent. And the last few years in particular have seen them take their game up to a next level. They've had some massive flops in the playoffs, it's true. 2018 and 2022 speak for themselves, but they've done some excellent things aside from that, and they have won tournaments. They have won multiple tournaments, which is something that most teams can't even dream of doing, as, like I said before, we still have 8 teams who haven't even won once. And just to showcase their dominance even further, they've actually done back-to-backs, which is something that only a couple of other teams in league history have managed to do in a tournament/playoff setting. And just to solidify their greatness even more, they by far have one of the best winning percentages in league history. I'm going to give the Gladiators an A, probably like an A-. They've never won a grand finals before like the Dallas Fuel, but on the other hand, they've never had a truly bad season. They've won numerous tournaments, so I feel like they can't be a B tier. They've got to be in the A range. And that gets me into their counterparts, aka the less successful LA Valiant. As a former diehard LA Valiant fan for the first 3 years, this really hurts to do, but let's just be honest with ourselves, they peaked in their first year. That was the highest high that this franchise has ever experienced, the inaugural season when the competition was arguably at its worst. Now mind you, they were an excellent team that year, 2nd place in the league overall, a Stage 4 title, they made the playoffs, they were solid, but it's really been downhill ever since. Season 2 was a massive letdown. Season 3, they had a bit of a resurgence, but there was some drama beforehand with talking about not being broken off this nonsense. But nonetheless, there was a bit of resurgence. They won their first ever playoff game in 2020. They won multiple tournament matches. They had like a top 8 record in the league. They were pretty good. Not amazing, but solid. And then we have the last 2 years where it really starts crumbling down. You go from a pretty respectable team to one of the least respected by far. There's so much cringiness and drama with Immortals and lying to our faces and giving the team's management over to China overseas where they had absolutely no budget whatsoever to build a roster these last few years. And the results speak for themselves. 2021 was arguably the worst season in Overwatch League history. Yeah, the Dragons lost like 24 more games or whatever it was in the inaugural season, but the Valiant had a even worse map win percentage. So we're talking one of the only winless seasons of all time, the worst map win percentage of all time, and then 2022 where they're just meh, fun to watch, but still losers. That's all they really have outside of that stage title, right? They've been fun to watch for the most part outside of one season. That doesn't offer you much, especially when you've had so much drama, mishappenings, horrible management, horrible coaching at times, really questionable decisions both on your front office end and just with your general decision on how you treat your players and your team. It made everyone look at them in a very weird light. They're one of the most poorly managed franchises of all time in this league, one of the least respected, and that's even when they had good seasons. It still felt like that somehow. Luckily for them though, they did win that tournament. They've had a couple of decent seasons, but because they've had a lack of playoff success and a lot of horrible seasons in between their good ones, they're no higher than C. The London Spitfire. This one might draw some controversy, but I'm thinking London are probably more towards the upper tiers. It's strange to say that, cause outside of 2018 and I guess 2022 to a certain extent, there's been a lot of bad seasons. 2020 and 2021, they were disastrous. That was one of the worst 2-year stretches we've ever seen. However, even some of the best teams ever have had to go through a couple of struggles. We talked about Dallas, but the Shock and the Dragons went through it as well. You gotta start somewhere to build something special. And honestly, the Spitfire have done this multiple times. First was their original core with C9 and Chengdu Panthera. I mean, for crying out loud, this is when they won their Grand Finals trophy, as well as a Stage 1 2018 title and a Stage 2 tournament appearance. That right there alone, this 1 year in the inaugural season, makes them more successful than like 90% of the other franchises in the league. I know it was a long time ago, it might seem like an afterthought, but nonetheless, their legacy is always going to be in the history books for what they did. And they carried that on. In 2019, there was more struggles, but they still made the playoffs that year, which is pretty nice. They were still like a top 6 team record-wise or whatever it was, top 7. And now you have 2022. After a couple of years of disaster, they're back and better than ever. They're a fun underdog story that ended up being a very solid and respectable team that won tournament matches, that made numerous playoff appearances, and had a sick playoff run to cap it off. So when you combine all of that, plus the lack of drama and good management overall, with just a couple of bad seasons sprinkled in between, the Spitfire have been a solid, outstanding franchise. They've had multiple years of playoff success, they've won the Grand Finals, which is something that only a couple of other teams have done, they've won a stage title, again, a bunch of other teams haven't done that or have even come close. The Spitfire have a good bit of accomplishments under their belts. I like what the Spitfire have done. Sometimes people meme on them and they make fun of them for the bad years and for being British or whatever, but they've been good, very reliable, one of the best franchises ever, whether you like it or not. London Spitfire get a A tier. The NYXL. This is a hard one, man. The first 3 years that they had are some of the best in league history over that span. The only team arguably more consistent was maybe like the Shock. They accomplished a ton in their first few years. That core they had with Jonek and those other boys leading the way was special. 2018, made the playoffs, had the best record in the league, won back-to-back stage titles. 2019, even though they had some ups and downs, still a really strong season overall, one of the best records in the league yet again. They were top 3 overall in the playoffs that year, and that carried over into 2020, where their record was a bit worse, but they still managed to sneak their way into that bronze medal spot in the APAC playoffs. It's as good of a start to a franchise that you could ever ask for. They didn't win a trophy, a grand finals trophy like they promised, but with expectations aside, that's a solid start. It's just what happens after that, along with the lack of grand finals, that puts a pretty sour taste in your mouth. 2021 was the start of a rebuild. It didn't work, but management started to get exposed because it went into 2022 as well, where they got even worse and had one of the worst records in the league. It showed us that maybe management lucked out into getting their first ever core. Like, maybe they just stumbled into it, and if it weren't for that franchise getting that lucky signing of that LW Blue squad, they may not be where they are today. But regardless of my feelings on how they've done these last few years and what could come in 2023, they had a really solid start to their existence. That 3-year stretch is extremely difficult to replicate, and they should feel proud of what they accomplished during that time. They've still won more than most, and to this day still have one of the best win percentages of all time. They built up a pretty awesome brand that was extremely respectable, and on top of that, they've actually fielded quite a few players that have meant a lot to this league. Specifically speaking, Jonek and his impact, but you can't forget about SBB, Pine, Libero, Mono, etc. They've all meant a ton to this league's history. There's question marks about how good their management truly is and how good they can actually be from here on out in the rest of their existence, but you can't take away what they did in those first 3 years. That's a long time of being really good every single season, being respectable, winning games. It's hard to see them as anything lower than like a B+. You can't put them in the A range in my eyes, but I think it's pretty reasonable to say that they've done just a bit more than the Atlanta Reign. The Paris/Vegas Eternal. They're kind of in that borderline Guangzhou Charge range to me /LA Valiant, where they've done enough to do something to leave their mark on this league, but it all came in a very short amount of time. Now, credit goes where it's due. You have to praise what they did that year. That was a special group with Sparkle leading the way. They had one of the best records in the league. There were points in time where they were extremely dominant and looked like title contenders, and on top of that, they went on one of the most epic and improbable tournament runs we have ever seen to capture the Summer Showdown title. 2020 was excellent, but that core disappeared before we knew it after one season, and outside of 2020, they've been rather unimpressive, mediocre or worse in fact. You can argue they had some upside in 2021. They were a lot better than people like myself were expecting. They were pretty enjoyable to watch as a dark horse underdog, so to speak, but it's not like they won a lot of significant games outside of like 1 or 2 upsets. Their record wasn't god tier by any means. They missed the playoffs. They didn't make any tournaments. So, generally speaking, looking at it in a vacuum, it wasn't anything that impressive. A lot better than we thought, but that's about it. And that's their second best season, because their other 2 were just bleh. 2019 was all about their pride and joy of being a fully EU roster, didn't work in their favor, GOATS just wasn't their comp, and they never really improved. In 2022, I mean, oh lord, it's one of the worst seasons of all time as they only won a single game, and they were lucky to win that one at that. The Eternal have had a lot of troubles, whether it be because of budget issues, management maybe not making the right decisions, especially during the early existence of their franchise. All of it builds up and has mostly made them irrelevant outside of one glory year. Due to them having a trophy to their names, I feel obligated to put them at C tier, but that is as high as they'll go. It's fusion time. Oh boy. This is so tough, because there's a lot of teams on here that have actually won things, and they haven't won anything. That's the big meme. They're the second place machine, but at the same time, they've always had the longevity. I'm in this very, very weird place with the Fusion/Infernal, I guess. I'll call them the Fusion for the sake of this video, but I'm at a crossroads. The Charge, Valiant, and Eternal have found nowhere near as much consistent success as Philadelphia did, but they have the tournament titles. Winning is very important, so you have to deduct a lot of points from the Fusion's legacy score, I guess you could say, because of that. but it's that ability to always be somewhat relevant and to be in situations where you can win that makes it so you have to rate them at least somewhat decently. Whether we're talking Overwatch or something else, that's a pretty rare occurrence to see in sports, where you're pretty decent or better 5 years straight. They may not have the fancy trophies, but at least they can be remembered for more than one brief shining moment. And in 2 of those seasons, they were arguably championship caliber. One of them they made the grand finals, and the other you argue they probably should have if it weren't for a late season collapse. And think about all the legacies of Alarm, God rest his soul, as well as Carpe, Poco, etc. So much has been built with this iconic franchise, and they're simply hard to forget. Regardless if you're just memeing on them for second place or for something else, they're always going to be in your memory one way or another. The worst they ever did was 2019, where they made the play-ins. That is the worst this franchise has ever done. They've had one losing season in 5 years, and they still made the playoffs that year because they accumulated a ton of points by playing well when it mattered. I know that may sound like a foreign concept for the Fusion, given all of their chokes, but you still have to win to get to the big dance, to climb to the top of the mountain, so to speak. Not everybody's capable of that, and the Fusion have done it multiple times. I mean, more times than we can even count at this point. 2018, stage finals appearance, grand finals appearance. 2020, multiple stage finals appearances, top 4 in the playoffs. 2021, somehow made it through Profit, Carpe's Kryptonite to make it to the playoffs. 2022, a stage finals appearance, as well as another really solid finish in the midseason madness against all of NA and APAC combined. The Fusion have won a lot of meaningful games. It makes up for their lack of titles in my eyes. I know for a lot of people it won't, but for me it makes sense. They've never actually reached that apex point, but they still have a lot more success than a lot of other teams will ever reach as long as this league exists. Philadelphia Fusion / Seoul Infernal get a B tier. Speaking of Seoul teams, how about the Dynasty? How can you really be a Dynasty if you don't really win that much? 2022 was the first time they ever had a first place finish in anything. To be labeled a dynasty, you either have to be winning consistently or at least getting close to winning every single time. Take away namesake and expectations, and it's still like that anyway. They've had their moments where they're pretty awesome, and to be honest with you, they've never truly had a terrible season. They've pretty much always had a winning record or better every single year. And in their defense, they have set themselves up multiple times throughout the years in final scenarios where they could take home a first place, but most of the time they couldn't get it done. 2022 is the only exception. They did get the job done, and they did so in pretty fantastic fashion. 2020 Melee Finals, they were only a map away from claiming that victory and possibly even sweeping the Shanghai Dragons at the time. And they also made the 2020 Grand Finals, which sometimes doesn't get talked about enough. Outside of the finals that we saw in 2022, the Seoul Dynasty did put up the most competitive finals effort in a losing effort. If we're going off league average, 3 tournament finals is pretty solid. They've done a lot of winning throughout the years, like they actually have won a lot more games than they have lost for sure, but there's been a lot of chokes and situations where things have been horribly managed. 2018 kind of speaks for itself and the disaster that was, but then we saw it more throughout 2020 in the regular season, and in 2021, lots of questionable decisions and choke jobs as well. Like, for every time they beat a big-time rival, there's like twice as many times where they choked to big-time rivals. I find what the Dynasty have done in their existence to be respectable. They have a first-place trophy, they've never had a losing season before, they've found tournament success and playoff success previously, they have all of that going for themselves. But what I don't like is the number of somewhat disappointing ends to seasons they've had, as well as big-time choke jobs. They've missed the playoffs multiple times before, and on top of that, they had the flop that was 2022, and they looked like a real contender at the time. There's mostly good, but a lot of bad sprinkled in as well, so Dynasty are going to get a B. Now for the San Francisco Shock. Oh, where could we possibly put them? This one's just so hard. Let's not beat around the bush. They're an S tier, easy S tier, the most successful franchise of all time, and it's not close. They had just one poor season ever, and it was to build a long-lasting dynasty that we would see over the next couple of years. And once that dynasty was done and it got torn down, they built what could be potentially a new one right away and immediately became contenders again, showing that their management and coaching is top tier. They're a good org, they treat their players well, they've had a lot of legends put on a Shock uniform, and they win. And I mean, they win a lot. 2 Grand Finals championships, where they were clearly the best team over that 2-year span where they won back-to-back. 3 tournament titles. 3 Grand Finals appearances over 4 years. When making the playoffs, the worst they ever did was top 4. Multiple second-place finishes in big-time tournaments and the playoffs. They have done literally everything under the sun, and they are one of the only 2 franchises that I consider to be a dynasty that have ever existed in the Overwatch League. The Shock have built a culture, and they embody winning and success in every single way, and they're the model of consistency that you want to reach for in this league. They're the easiest S tier of all time. Speaking of S tiers, we have the only team that's going to be with them in this video, the Shanghai Dragons. Let's just put them in there now. It may seem a little weird to put them in the definitive S tier considering what happened the first year where they went 0-40, and it's something you can't forget about. It's a part of their history books for sure, but it's what they've done with their legacy since then that completely makes up for it. Aside from just completely improving in the win percentage department and being one of the best teams in the league multiple years in a row from 2020 to 2022 essentially, they also have the most tournament titles of all time, winning at least one every single season from 2019 until the present. How many is that, you may ask? 6. They have their obvious achievement of winning the grand finals in arguably the most dominant fashion we have ever seen, and they finished top 3 in 2020. So from the start of their iconic dynasty until the end, they only had one flop year, and even then in 2022, they still did manage to win a tournament. And just generally speaking, what they did over the last 3 years is absolutely absurd, and only the Shock can even come close to matching them over that time span. The Dragons have it all, man, and if they had one more grand finals, I'd argue they were even more successful than the Shock, but unfortunately, they just fall short of what you'd consider to be the number 1 spot. But still, a pretty easy S tier, seeing as they're one of the most consistent franchises and winningest franchises, as well as one of the best managed. On the topic of management, we're moving to one where they're not so well managed. The Toronto Defiant. Do I really need to say it? They've just been the definition of mid from the very beginning of their existence up until the present. They've had a few okay seasons, but nothing out of the ordinary. No real playoff success to speak of, and only 2 decent tournament runs overall, and they didn't make the finals in either of those. The best product they ever put out was last year, 2022, where they somehow got 3rd place in a tournament, good for them, but they also put up a mediocre record and just barely made the playoffs. That is the best they're working with. That is their peak, ladies and gentlemen. They are mid. Like, I don't like to be that guy, I don't like to be toxic, but that's just the label they have on themselves right now. And I think the thing that really does it for me that makes Toronto really, really bad on the spectrum, aside from their lack of success, is the inconsistency factor. I'll give them one thing, they're consistently just mediocre, but they're also consistently changing what they have. Management is extremely unstable. They're never satisfied. They never want to stick with a core. They barely keep any players from the previous season on their rosters. They always want to start fresh, and it's so confusing and hard to support them or get behind them. It's no way to win. You're kind of just chucking things at the wall, hoping that eventually something will stick. And something did stick last year, but they still weren't satisfied with it. It is so bizarre how they can never ever just stick with what they have. Defiant are in a D tier pretty easily in my eyes. They have no real success, and that lack of stability is a real turnoff. The Vancouver Titans. I mean, the other Canadian team isn't much better off. They're in the same situation as a lot of other teams in C tier, which is why they're going to that exact spot. Generally, I think you can make a good case that they're D tier, simply due to the fact that outside of one season, they have arguably been the worst team in the league over a 3-year stretch. But I'm going to give them some slack because of what happened in 2019 and how magical they were and how dominant they were. It's one of the most dominant seasons of all time to this day. They won a tournament title. They made the grand finals. They found massive playoff success that year. That alone propels them over any other franchise in D tier, I'm sorry to say. If I'm putting an all-time bad level team over the last couple of years like the Valiant in C, then I think it's natural to do the same for the Titans, who have also found pretty minimal success and had multiple awful years back-to-back from 2020 to 2021. The Titans have been poorly managed, that is no secret, based off of the epic fumbling of the bag that happened with their runaway core, as well as just the horrible teams that they've built the last couple of years. But still, they have won something, and if we're comparing it to if you've done nothing at all, or at least something, they should be over the D tier teams, even if they don't have as much longevity as some of the other ones. These last 3 years might be the worst stretch of all time for any Overwatch League franchise. I don't think any team has put up a lower winning percentage in that time. They found literally 0 playoff success and playoff appearances for that matter. and they haven't won any real tournament games as well, with just a single tournament appearance since 2019. They've cemented their legacy though, their records are in the history books, so they're still going to be in that C tier, even if I desperately want to put them in D for all of the horrible seasons that they've had. And last but certainly not least is the Washington Justice. Another team that has literally never won a tournament or grand finals before and has pretty much no playoff success to speak for outside of 2020, where they had their magical miracle run where they most likely got lucky because of the meta shift. It's truly their only claim to fame, and that's in a season where they barely won it all and only got to make the playoffs because of COVID. They're lucky to get there, they're lucky to go on the run, and they have no other real feats to speak of. We're in borderline Outlaws territory, where you have this meaningful playoff run which does do a lot for your legacy, but not much else, and when we're considering longevity and what you've done over a 5-year span, that's just not gonna cut it. Their first 2 years of existence were pretty abysmal. We talk about the 2020 playoff run, but everything else leading up to that moment, they were terrible. 2019, they were terrible outside of one stage. They were poorly managed and poorly constructed across every single way you could really think of. Their coaching has been historically bad for the most part. They've done a lot of poor things. There's been a bit of a turnaround in like the second stage of their career, I guess you could say, their legacy. 2021, they're a pretty decent squad. Maybe a bit of a letdown, but they still made the playoffs, regardless of if they got bounced in the first round or not. And in 2022, they were pretty decent. They're competitive against some good teams at times. They pushed them to their limits, and that came in spite of a lot of roster drama and management disasters behind the scenes, where ownership wanted to go in a different direction because they didn't like the profits they were making from the Overwatch League. They nearly destroyed that team from the ground up, and they still managed to be pretty okay. But when that's all you're really known for, as well as a lucky playoff run that didn't even get you to the grand finals, mind you, you're just not going to be remembered that much in the Overwatch League history books. I'm sorry to tell you. If a few things go differently in 2020, they might not have any sort of real feats to their names whatsoever. It is literally that bad. They've always just been unlucky. Things can never really seem to go their way. Now they're going in a new direction in 2023. Things don't really look like they're going to be looking up anytime soon. So for the Justice, they're going to be an easy D. And there you go. After numerous minutes of me being an Overwatch historian and nerd, and likely criticizing your favorite team, we've reached the end of the tier list. Here is a general overview of what we're working with. Sadly, the tier with the most teams in it would be our bottom tier, and these teams all consist of guys who either have never won anything before, or mostly just had one decent season where they really did anything, with no real longevity to speak of, or a lot of disappointments, or both. C tier are teams that either had just their one moment of fame, or just a couple of peaks to just barely put them above that bottom tier. And in B tier, we have teams that either have won at least one time or have been pretty good throughout their entire existence. A tier consists of big-time champions that have won more than one time, and S tier are what I consider to be the true dynasties of the Overwatch League. What do you think of my tier list, guys? Do you agree? Disagree? What would you have done differently if you were in my shoes, and what arguments would you make as to why you'd make those changes? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and you want more tier list content just like this in the future, give this video a big fat thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.